he was the master of macabre, the OG of goths. Edgar Allan Poe, a world-known poet and writer, best known for his poem The Raven. Though his life was similar to the macabre and dark stories he told, the real mystery to this day is his death. Today we will be exploring the theories surrounding the final days of his life and ultimately, his untimely death. Hi, horror friends, and welcome to Obscurify. Poe's story is a rather tragic one. Born 19th January 1809 in Boston, and second child to actors Elizabeth Arnold Poe and David Poe Jr. His father abandoned the family the following year in 1810. When his mother died of tuberculosis in 1811, Edgar was taken in by his presumed godfather, John and Frances Allan, in Richmond, Virginia. John Allan was a wealthy tobacco merchant. Despite not being formally adopted by the pair, Poe lived with John and Frances well into young adulthood. Before Poe enlisted in university, he became engaged to Sarah Elmira Royster. Poe attended the University of Virginia, and was said to have excelled academically, however left only after a year due to the lack of funds. Poe and John Allan quarreled many times due to the fact that Allan refused to contribute more to his education. With no help from his presumed godfather, Poe resorted to gambling to provide extra income to further his education. However, this only dug the hole of financial debt even deeper for Poe. In fact, Poe was so poor at a stage he had to burn his own furniture, just to stay warm. A bad situation was made worse when Poe had learned that his sweetheart, Elmira, was now married to another man. With no other choice or option, Poe enlisted in the United States Army in 1827 as a private, under an assumed name Edgar A. Perry. In that year Poe released his first book, a poetry collection titled Tamerlane and Other Poems, only to be expelled from West Point after only 8 months, by making himself absent from all drills and classes for a week. With the death of John Allan's wife in 1829, Poe and Allan reached a temporary agreement. Later Poe declared his intention of being a poet and writer, and parted ways with Allan. Poe then fell into the care of his Aunt Maria Clem. When he was settled into a stable home, Poe started publishing poems and short stories, one of which won a contest. This grew his notoriety and led to an editorial position at the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. Things finally started to go right for Poe. Alongside his newly found career, Poe fell in love with a girl. This girl was named Virginia, who was oddly enough his cousin, and even more odd, half his age. Despite the circumstances, in 1835 when Poe was 27 and Virginia was only 13, they got married in Richmond. It was said that their union was a happy one, but it is largely debated whether or not their marriage was consummated. Though Poe was newly employed, the pair was plagued with money problems. Essentially, Poe moved around, taking on different writing jobs, but found it difficult making an adequate living. When Poe's first collection of short stories was published, The Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, which contained his most well-known story, The Fall of the House of Usher, that was published in 1840. He was not paid in money, but instead he received a payment of 25 copies of his own book. In 1845, 5 years later, the New York Mirror published Poe's poem The Raven, and it was an instant success that skyrocketed him to national acclaim. However, with Poe, tragedy was never far away, and in 1847, Virginia died at the age of 24 of tuberculosis. Heartbroken, Poe drowned his sorrows in wild sprees of alcoholism. But by the summer of 1849, Poe was on the road to sobriety and again living in Richmond, where Poe once again met up with his first fiancée, Elmira Sarah Shelton. The pair were soon again engaged and plans to marry once Poe returned home, after reading engagements in Philadelphia and New York. On September 27, Poe left Richmond by train, stopping the very next day in Baltimore, never making it to Philadelphia for his presumed engagements. Poe's whereabouts for the next 5 days, until this day, remain unknown. On October 3, Poe was found by Joseph W. Walker, an employee of the Baltimore Sun, in a delirious and immobile state, dressed in cheap, ill-fitting clothes. He was discovered in gutter outside a tavern called Gunner's Hall. Gunner's Hall was a polling station for the 4th Ward. Joseph asked Poe if there's anyone he could contact on his behalf. Poe mentioned a magazine editor named Joseph Snodgrass. Walker immediately wrote to Snodgrass a quick note urging his assistance. It said, quote, "There is a gentleman rather worse for wear, who goes under the cognomen Edgar A. Poe and who appears under great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance." End quote. Poe was taken to Washington Hospital that afternoon. The doctors assumed him to be drunk and weary. However, Poe never fully regained consciousness to be able to detail what had happened to him. Dr. John J. Moran wrote to his aunt/mother-in-law, Maria Clem, that Poe's last days were filled with, quote, "vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. His face was pale and his whole person drenched in perspiration." End quote. Poe spent his final days in fits of delirium. According to Dr. Moran, Poe repeatedly called out the name Reynolds, a name who to this day remains a mystery. On October 7, just 5 hours past midnight, at the age of 40, Edgar Allan Poe died. Sources say he used his dying breath to say, quote, "Lord help my poor soul." End quote. The official cause of death was brain swelling or phrenitis. 2 days later, Poe was buried in Baltimore graveyard in an unmarked grave. A small ceremony was held, but nothing more. With Poe unable to explain what happened while in the hospital and no autopsy ever performed, theories regarding about what happened to the famous macabre writer emerged. The first theory is that Edgar Allan Poe died of some alcohol-related syndrome, like alcohol dehydrogenase, dipsomania, or delirium tremens. It was well known that Poe had alcohol problems, but he was also genetically predisposed not to be able to handle alcohol. According to the curator of the Poe Museum, Chris Sempner, quote, "It has been documented that after a glass of wine he was staggering drunk. His sister suffered the same problem. It seems to be something hereditary." End quote. Poe had fallen ill before leaving Richmond. After making a recovery, he was told by his physician, another such attack could prove fatal. Poe replied with, "Well, if people would not tempt me, I would not fall," suggesting that the illness was brought on by about drinking. This theory, however, fails to explain his 5-day disappearance or his ill-fitting clothes. The second theory is cooping. Voter fraud was common in Baltimore in around the mid-1800s. Unscrupulous politicians were known to employ cooping, a practice of hiring local goons to kidnap random men on the street. They would force alcohol or drugs in them and force them to vote multiple times while wearing disguises. This theory makes a lot of sense, and explains why Poe was not in his normal clothes and why he was found outside a polling station. During the mid-1800s, voters were given some alcohol after voting as a celebration. However, because of Poe's genetic sensitivity to alcohol, if he had been forced to vote several times, thus having to drink multiple drinks, it could explain the drunken stupor he was discovered in. The third theory is a brain tumor. This theory could explain his odd behavior. 26 years later, after Poe was buried in an unmarked grave, a statue was erected to honor his grave site. During this time his remains were exhumed. The macabre writer's coffin and corpse were in terrible condition. As workers tried to move his coffin, it fell apart, spilling Poe's remains. Workers noted that there was a mass rolling around in Poe's skull. At the time, news articles claimed that it was Poe's brain, quote, "dried and hardened in the skull," end quote. Of course, this statement was dismissed. Soft brain tissue would have been the first to decay after the poet's death. It is much more likely to have been a tumor that could have calcified and hardened after his death. It was also known that in Poe's early life a doctor informed him that he had a lesion on his brain, which could also explain his sensitivity to alcohol. This theory has yet to be debunked, and still stands as one of the most likely ways the master of mystery had died. The fourth theory is foul play. There were many that believed Edgar was murdered by the family of his soon-to-be bride, Elmira Shelton. The theory suggests that Elmira's family didn't want her to marry a man like Poe. And after failed attempts to scare and threaten the poet, they decided the only way was to get rid of Poe entirely. This theory suggests that the poet went into hiding from his murderous, soon-to-be family members. It explains why Poe was missing for almost a week. It also explains why he wasn't dressed in his usual attire. To this day, the death of Edgar Allan Poe remains a mystery shrouded with murder, conspiracies, and thugs. It seems fitting that the man who invented the genre of dark murderous mysteries that he should leave behind one of the biggest mysteries of our time. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and bell notification to get more of our creepy content. We will see you in the next video. Until then, stay curious.